I think we have quite a few participants already, so we should start.
Yes, thank you.
And on behalf of the Independent Council for Road Safety International, I really have the privilege of inviting Dr. Rune Elvik to participate as a speaker in the third session of our Global Road Safety Dialogues. And for those who did not attend our first two sessions, I would like to again give us a brief summary that this series was inaugurated by Mr. Luis Lota, Director of the National Road Safety Agency of Colombia last Tuesday, and a chairperson, Mr. Barry Sherman, who's a member of Parliament in UK, gave the inaugural welcome. And these dialogues include 24 international experts on road safety who have agreed to discuss issues facing us in road safety interventions and research around the world. I must say that Dr. Elvik agreeing to join us today and discuss methods and common pitfalls to gaining valid knowledge in road safety is real benefit for all of us. He has worked as a road safety researcher at the Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo in Norway since 1980. What's very interesting is that his initial education was as a political scientist at the University of Oslo. And he's today one of the most well-known experts on road safety internationally. 16 years ago, he published his handbook of road safety measures, which became the most reliable source for finding out what works in road safety and what does not. A few years ago, he updated this work and published the second edition of the manual. All of us look forward to his systematic reviews and meta-analyses to stay updated in the field. And I would think that he's probably the most informed professionals in the world in the field of road safety. I guess by putting together these handbooks, he's probably read more research papers than any of us in the last 30 years. He's also an advisor to ICoRSI, our organization, which keeps us on the right track. Rune, it's a privilege to have you with us on this in this series, and also a privilege to have you as a friend over the last couple of decades. And it's my pleasure to invite you to the session today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This was a very praising introduction, and I feel almost embarrassed listening to it. But anyway, let's get started with the discussion and the dialogue on the methods and common pitfalls to gaining valid knowledge. Thank you, Will. I hope it stays stable now and that we can run through it without further trouble.
You just have to tell me to go to the next slide.
Yes, we can go to the next one right now. And that is where I discuss what we mean by the concept of valid knowledge, and where I would propose to say that knowledge is valid if we cannot give any reasons for doubting that it shows the truth. And this, of course, is a bit different from actually claiming that we know the truth. That is, in my opinion, in our field of research, a claim we cannot make really. We can only claim that we have no reasons to believe that our knowledge or that a specific study does not show the truth. So from that point of view, what we can gain is an approximation to the truth. And the closer we believe to approximate it, the more valid is our knowledge. This also means that to judge validity, we need to be specific about it, specify what we mean by the concept and what influences the validity of knowledge as it comes in degrees of validity. We can go to the next one now. Yes, the topic of validity has a long history in social research. And almost 60 years ago, Campbell and Stanley first proposed to classify it into four, been developed over the years. And the most updated presentation of it was in the book by Shadish, Cook and Campbell in 2002. And they distinguish between four types of validity: statistical conclusion validity, construct validity, or I would maybe prefer to use the term theoretical validity for it; internal validity, which refers to the possibility of claiming that a causal relationship has been found; and external validity, which refers to the possibility of generalizing the findings of a study or a set of studies to a different context than where the study was made. I think all these concepts, all these types of validity can be applied to road safety studies, and it can be used as a checklist to assess the quality of studies and the extent to which the findings can be regarded as valid. Shadish, Cook and Campbell, they identify what they refer to as threats to validity, or what we might call methodological problems that we may encounter. That list has grown longer with every revision of this conceptual framework, and it now runs to 33 items. And I should say that I don't remember all of them, but there are lots of them, especially for internal validity and construct validity. The list of problems that may arise is quite long. But this has its main application, of course, in non-experimental studies, because we all know that the most valid knowledge is gained from randomized controlled trials or experiments, preferably performed in large samples. And any other method designed to evaluate the effect of something will be considerably less valid than an experimental study. We can go to the next one now. By the way, Dinesh and I talked about this some days ago, and we agreed that Dinesh could intervene at any point. It is not supposed to be a lecture, but a dialogue. So whenever Dinesh feels...
A couple more slides, and then we can have a discussion.
Yes, let's do that. Well, a little more than 20 years ago, I wanted to find out whether evaluation studies, road safety evaluation studies published in scientific journals had a better quality than those that were not published in scientific journals. At that time, Leonard Evans, for example, he argued that more studies should undergo peer review and be checked and published in peer-reviewed journals. As part of that study, I classified these studies into four main groups: experiments, well-controlled observational studies, poorly controlled observational studies, and a group that I call inadequate study designs. And broadly speaking, I think we can have confidence and trust the two first of these, experiments and well-controlled observational studies, whereas we would often be more in doubt about whether we should believe in the poorly controlled or inadequate studies. And these actually are a majority of the studies that I located for this study. However, when I compared, and then we can see on the next slide, when I compared those that had been published in peer-reviewed publications with those that had not, there was a tendency for those that had been peer-reviewed to be slightly better than those that were not. You can see here the gray bars indicate the peer-reviewed ones, and a majority of those, although only 52% though, but the majority were experiments or well-controlled observational studies. And you can see that the percentage is higher than for the non-peer-reviewed studies, where these categories, experiments and well-controlled observational studies, made up only 35% of the total number of studies, and a total and a share of 65% of the non-peer-reviewed consisted of poorly controlled observational studies or inadequate studies.
Rune, we have a small discussion right now.
Yes.
This is very interesting, that if someone, even though they're smaller in number, but there's many studies which are not peer-reviewed, but you would consider them good studies. So that makes it difficult for a lot of young scholars to access them if they're not in journals, for example. So have you faced that difficulty also?
Yes, it is true that in general, studies that are not published in peer-reviewed journals are more difficult to identify and retrieve. But what I have done often when I have worked on the Handbook of Road Safety Measures is to go to the websites of institutes. And these days you can find a lot there. I mean, large research institutes like the TRL in Great Britain, the SWOF in the Netherlands, and VTI in Sweden. These days they publish all of their reports on their web pages, and some of them have even put older reports there. Only yesterday I was looking at the SWOF report published in 1993. And as far as I know, there is no peer-reviewed version of that report, but there is an institute report from the SWOF Institute that you can access. So fortunately, it is a bit easier these days than it used to be to find these studies, but you have to look for them, of course, by going to the websites of the various research institutions that you know produces research in this field.
Rune, but there's another problem for those of us in some parts of the world, that there's language is a problem, because some of the good studies done at VTI or SWOF, at VTI they're in Sweden and only abstract is available. And the same thing with many of the studies done at SWOF. How do you, I guess you can understand the studies done at VTI, but suppose you see a study from SWOF in Netherlands and it's only in Dutch, what do you do?
Well, I had a look at it. I think, but that could be wrong, of course, that I can understand enough Dutch to make sense of at least the main findings and the design they used in the study. But it gets to become a problem for many languages. If the study is in Finnish, for example, that is a language which is generally not understood very much outside Finland. So in some cases you are lost by a language problem, yes.
But I guess what we can say as of now, or as of this slide, is that though we can trust the journal peer-reviewed studies more, but even half of them can't be trusted that much. And the other side is that the studies which are not peer-reviewed, though fewer of them are very good, but they should be looked at by serious researchers. Would that be a good summary?
Yes, I would agree on that. Okay.
So let's go ahead.
Yes, let's take the next one. Now, on the background of this study, these observations, I believe we are facing a dilemma. We, of course, always want to tell policymakers that we strongly recommend that you base your policy on the best available scientific evidence. But then, to be fully honest about it, we should add, but we must warn you that most of this evidence should not be trusted. And is there really a way out of this? Well, I put it like that to sharpen the issue, of course. But what I would like to discuss now is if there is a way out of this, and I give some pointers to that on my next slide, so we can go to that. Yeah, I believe that although there are too few experiments in road safety and more experiments could have been made and still can be made, it will never be the case that all or even most of the road safety evaluation studies will be experimental. Observational studies will continue to dominate, and therefore we should have some guidelines with respect to which of these studies we can trust and apply. And first of all, I would then say that good before and after studies that control at least for the well-known confounding factors in before and after studies should be trusted. The same applies to well-controlled case control studies. And I would even say that if we go to the second lowest level in the histograms I showed you, the poorly controlled studies, in some cases, we should even trust such studies. Not each of them, but if we can collect a set of these studies and try to make sense of their findings by means of meta-analysis, and if we by doing so can find a systematic pattern in them, then by virtue of that fact, we might want to trust even those studies. But that applies then to the, we can go to the next then, unless you have.
Rune, let me remind the participants and the audience that if they send in the questions as we go along, it'll be easier for me to keep track of them and have a discussion later. So they should start posting questions as we go along. But in the meantime, I would also like to ask you, can you give one example of well-controlled study that has influenced policy in a good direction and has a major impact?
Yeah, I find it difficult to name one single study that has had such an impact, but I could, in the case of Norway, mention a couple of cases. Sure. One of these cases is about roundabouts, and we have built lots of roundabouts in Norway, and I think that has been influenced by research. And there have been several Norwegian studies evaluating the effects of roundabouts, and besides lots of foreign studies as well. And these have definitely influenced the practice and has promoted the use of that as a type of junction design in Norway. A second case would be speed limits, because our speed limit policy is largely evidence-based, I believe, and the evidence has been accumulated over the years by many studies that have been made with respect to the effects of speed limits in Norway. But both these cases, it is a set of studies and not a single one that has been influential.
So in that case, can you give us an example of poorly controlled studies which have influenced decision makers in making the wrong decisions?
Well, actually now, no, not right now, because typically when they make ill-informed decisions, it is not because they have been badly informed by a bad study. It is rather because they neglect research at all and base their decisions on personal opinions or what is politically popular at the moment or what a lobbying group wants or things like that. And not so much on bad studies that have provided bad guidance for policy.
I get confused sometimes. I've driven on European roads in some countries in Northern Europe, 2-lane roads, which have speed limits of 90 kilometers an hour. Whereas all the recommendations which have come out of Europe, good studies say that 2-lane roads in the countryside should not have speed limits of more than 60 or 70. How do you think that's happened?
Well, yeah. That might probably more be the result of lobbying for higher speed limits than research. We used to have quite a few of those roads even in Norway, because either those roads have been converted to 2+1 roads with a median safety barrier, or they have been replaced by, but that was because we found in research that those roads with 90 kilometers had lots of fatal crashes, lots of head-on crashes, and due to the high speed, many of those were fatal, and that influenced policy as well. But I know we need not go any further than our neighboring country of Sweden, which was where Vision Zero was invented. They still have a lot of those roads in Sweden.
Okay. Now, before we go on to the next part of your presentation, since there are a lot of people here who have joined us, who are doing research at this time, how would you warn them about trusting studies in journals today with a lot of multi-variable regressions and so on, which confuse the reader? And how do they trust the results?
Well, the first problem, the first challenge you face with that type of study is to understand the results. Because in many of those multivariate models, they apply various transformations of variables, logarithmic terms or exponential terms or whatever. And so if you simply observe a regression coefficient presented in the study, you need to pay very careful attention to what that coefficient refers to. If it refers to a transformed variable or in an original form or whatever. But
okay. Yeah.
I have basically the same point of view regarding this as Ezra Hauer has, and that is that this type of study is ill-suited for evaluating the effects of things. Most of these studies do not show causal relationships or do not show the effects of road safety interventions, I would say.
Okay, so let's go ahead because I think you make the issue clearer as we go along.
Yeah, yes, okay. Yeah, well, here is one example of a study I made and how I think one should present the results of a study to educate the reader about the effects of various factors influencing the result. Let us look at the middle there, killed or seriously injured. There were 71, and in the after period, there were 11. the before and after periods were equally long. So you can compare the numbers directly because they refer to periods of equal duration. But you see that during this period, between the before and after period, there was a strong declining trend. So that accounting for that trend, we would expect a little more than 40 killed or seriously injured road users in the after period. And furthermore, we found by means of accident modeling that the number in the before period was a bit higher than the long-term mean. So accounting for regression to the mean, you get an even slightly lower number of 39.2. And the difference between the 39.2 and the 11 is the effect attributed to the measure, which is still a large one, a reduction of 72%. But it is worth noting that actually the strongest influential factor in this particular case was the long-term trend, because the long-term trend reduced the number of accidents by, well, almost 20, no, a little more than 30 actually. Whereas the effect of the safety measure, the motorway, was a reduction of only 28 from 39 to 11. And by displaying results in this way, the reader can judge how controlling for the various confounding factors have influenced the results of the study and see the specific contribution made in this case by 3 factors: long-term trends, regression to the mean, and the safety measure. We can go to the next one then. Yeah, I have chosen road lighting is one case of studies which are often rated as quite poor. And a very commonly applied design for evaluating the effects of road lighting is a simple before and after study, where you have divided accidents into those that take place in darkness and those in daylight. And then you compute an odds ratio estimate of effect as shown here by these hypothetical numbers. And in this case, if you have a quite short before period and a quite short after, there is no control for regression to the mean. And there is no control for changes in traffic volume, at least not explicitly. And now, the question is, can we still trust these studies? To answer that question, I think it is useful to propose some hypothesis regarding the effects of road lighting, and I have proposed. Yes, next one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my proposal is that we take into account the whole set of studies. One way might notice, of course, is that darkness is a universal risk factor. It is something you find all over the world, and therefore one would expect the results to be fairly consistent if you compare them over time, and if you compare studies made in different countries, there is really no reason to expect the results to differ a lot. So one would rather expect them to be quite close to each other and consistent. Another thing I think we can say a priori is that one should expect a smaller effect in urban areas because there are many other sources of artificial lighting in urban areas than just road lighting. So the road will somehow be a bit lit up all the same, even if it doesn't have road lighting. And then road lighting works, of course, by increasing the distance you can detect objects. You can detect or make an evasive maneuver and so on. And that means both that you will be able to avoid some crashes altogether, but it also means that those that still happen are likely to happen at a lower impact speed than before you had road lighting. So based on that, it is also reasonable to expect that it will have a larger effect on fatal crashes than on less serious crashes. So once we have formulated these hypotheses, we can use meta-analysis to test them, to see if we actually do find this pattern or not. And what then do we find? Well, let's first look at different countries. This is in the next graph. Now here I have plotted chronologically the effects of road lighting on total crashes, and total crashes, that is the sum of fatal injury and property damage, all of them put together in various countries. And the first study I was able to find was reported in 1948 in the United States. And it is marked here by 1 USA. And then the next study was 7 years later, 1955, in Great Britain, number 2 here, GBR. And then the third study was in 1958 in Switzerland. And then as we move along, we add countries. And as you can see here, when new countries are added, this average curve fluctuates a bit up and down, but there is no clear trend in it. The addition of a new country never lead to any large changes in the mean estimate of effect. It's stable. And of course, as the number of studies and the size of the accident sample increases, the confidence interval gets smaller as well, as you can see by the dotted lines above and below the weighted mean effect. So what this tells me is what I say in the headline: the effects of road lighting are the same in all countries where they have been evaluated. Let us look now at another indicator here of consistency. And that is, if we look at the size of the effects in relation to the size of the increase in risk, we find also a very systematic pattern. Pedestrians experience a very high increase in the risk of fatal injury in darkness, a factor of 4.6. But corresponding to that, you also see a very large reduction of pedestrian fatalities when you install road lighting. It is reduced by 78%, gives a relative risk then of 0.22. That corresponds to 78% reduction. And so you see this has the nice shape of a pyramid. The smaller the increase in the risk in darkness, the smaller is the accident reduction attributed to road lighting when it is installed. And a systematic pattern like this cannot reasonably, in my opinion, be the result of confounding or bad data or other weaknesses in the studies. It is the result shows that the decline is the result of road lighting mostly, I would say. And so, yeah, we can go to the next one. Yes, you have.
I think you're going to go on to another. Here,
yeah.
You've given the importance of getting studies from a large number of countries or many countries to understand this. So I suppose when there's a theoretical background to why this is happening and we understand that, it becomes easier. But when you don't have enough theory, for example, for helmets, we don't have to do any more research that they're effective, or seatbelts or airbags or crashworthiness of cars and road lighting, etc. But when we go to a few other things where I would say traffic volume, traffic patterns, different vehicles on the road matters, then it would become, I guess, much more important to look at theory and also different countries. So since a large number of international agencies are spending millions of dollars promoting road safety around the world, but as you know from your handbook, and we found out from our evidence gap map, that there are very, very few studies which have evaluated interventions in about 70% or 80% of the countries with different kinds of traffic. So what would be your, for example, say roundabouts? All the roundabout studies have been done largely where cars dominate. But in many parts of the world, motorcycles are huge numbers. So how would you suggest we trust studies? What is the transferability of the studies? And why do you think people are not funding studies around the world?
Well, these are many issues. Now, with respect to transferability, it is partly, it can partly be assessed empirically, I think, but partly you have to assess it on a more theoretical level. You can get some way in assessing it empirically if you are in the happy situation that studies have been made in a large number of different countries, and you can compare the results of studies made in different countries and see if they are consistent or inconsistent. And if they are inconsistent, of course, that indicates that they may not necessarily be transferable, or there may be valid reasons why the effects are different in one country than in another. But normally this will not get us very far, because most of the road safety measures that we describe in our handbook of road safety measures, which we continue to update in Norwegian, most of them have been evaluated in less than 10 or 15 countries around the world. And I can only mention one single topic that has been studied in more countries, and that's speed and safety. I have found studies in 20 different countries dealing with speed and safety. But that is the largest number of countries. And no African countries are represented. Very few Asian countries are represented. There are a few. I can remember studies that have been made in Malaysia, in Pakistan. At least I remember those two countries. Latin American studies are almost non-existent. And I am not so confident that the results from the United States or Western Europe about roundabouts, for example, can necessarily be transferred to India or Vietnam, or countries where motorcycles predominate, or where you have other types of vehicles as well. Not necessarily motorized, but unmotorized as well. We just don't know. And more research is needed to find out. And it is not very wise if the funding agencies only are able or willing to fund road building and road construction, and not the research needed to evaluate the impacts of that. Because as long as it remains like that, we will never gain this knowledge.
Thank you, Rune. We'll go along to your next slide.
Yep. Well, this is how I view this range of replications, as I would call it, where I count in a diagram the number of years where studies have been reported, and I count the number of countries and I add the two. And then based on that, you can compute some consistency statistics showing the consistency of findings between years and between countries. And of course, the higher the value of that statistic, I invented a simple statistic that takes on values between 0 and 1. And the closer to 1 it gets, the more consistent results are. But whether you can if you can extrapolate that to countries that were not included in the sample is, of course, an entirely different matter. You can do so in some cases, I think, but definitely not in all cases. Yeah, we can maybe go to the next one. Yeah, well, we already touched upon this. And I think as far as road lighting, roundabouts, guardrails, seatbelts, motorcycle helmets, and speed limits are concerned, the evidence can be assessed in theoretical terms as well. Do the findings make sense from a theoretical point of view? And if we take roundabouts, for example, since that I know that Dinesh might want to discuss that, I think it makes good sense that they reduce the number of fatalities a great deal. They have a somewhat smaller effect on injuries and probably no, or maybe even an adverse effect on property damage accidents. That makes sense from a point of view of the laws of physics, because what you do when you construct a roundabout is that you lower speed, and any crashes that will still occur will occur at a lower speed and at sharp angles. You will not have head-on crashes there. It will be between vehicles or road users going in the same direction. But that applies to motor vehicles. If you think about pedestrians, cyclists, or other types of vehicles, it is not so obvious necessarily that they will gain from roundabouts. And it is not so easy to rely on the laws of physics to predict the effects for those road users as it would be for motor vehicles or cars, maybe more specifically. If we think then about road safety measures that are targeting the human factor, how about the transferability of those and their applicability? We can look at that in the next one if you think we can go to, yes, thank you. Well, we know, of course, from Brian O'Neill made a study and wrote a journal paper summarizing the research on driver training. And you often hear the point of view that there are no good evaluations of it. That is definitely wrong. It is, in fact, one of the best evaluated measures. And there are several randomized controlled trials of driver training, consistently showing that it is ineffective. I believe that is a theoretically plausible finding. That it makes sense to me that it should be ineffective. I can explain why later on if you want me to.
Why you could spend a couple of minutes on that.
Yes, okay. Well, I wrote a little bit about it in a paper in Accident Analysis and Prevention in 2010, and basically my argument is that it is difficult to teach people that they don't know anything. And that is the educational challenge driver educators are facing. Because the basic perceptual and motor skills that you need to operate a car are quite simple. And any teenager will learn those skills in a matter of a few hours. You quickly figure out how to operate whatever instruments you need to operate, and more and more cars have automatic gears, so you don't need to learn to shift gears the old way any longer as well. And when you have learned that, many people will erroneously think that they know driving, because they are able to operate the machine, operate the car easily. But that is an erroneous belief. It is overconfidence. And the challenge is how one should develop a training scheme that does not induce this kind of overconfidence, that makes a driver obtaining the license understand that the major part of their learning still remains. And going to driver school is expensive in most countries, and it is very expensive in Norway. So there is a strong incentive to go to take the license test as early as possible. So most of those who pass that test, they pass it at a low grade, so to speak. They're close to failing, but they are allowed to pass. And then that, of course, further influences their belief that this is easy and something they know fully. And it doesn't help matter that this also happens at an age when most people are trying to become independent of their parents and listen more to their peers than to their parents, and want to get independent and so on. And all this conspires, I think, to make it very difficult to have a training system that does not make the pupils overconfident. And overconfidence actually can lead to worse outcomes. I mean, it was found in the experiment made in the mid-1980s in the United States, the DeKalb County driver training study, that those who got the most training, the most advanced training, actually had the highest accident rates. And those who didn't get much training had the lowest ones. Great.
So, yeah, we can go ahead.
Yeah. Well, if you look at campaigns, and there's lots of studies about campaigns, but many of them are poor and don't control very well for different confounding factors. And attempts have been made in several research projects to make a sense of these studies, and the last one was a large EU project called CAST, and a few colleagues of mine at the Institute actually published a paper in Accident Analysis and Prevention, making a meta-analysis of these studies. But I don't think the findings of that meta-analysis made much sense. So I think that attempts to make sense of these studies have been unsuccessful so far. And then enforcement, well, that is probably effective in many cases, I would say so. The trouble with enforcement is to maintain it in the long term. Because if the police suddenly carry out lots of enforcement, they will quickly find that drivers and road users change their behavior. And once that happens, they stop doing enforcement and things slide back to what they were before the enforcement started. So the challenge is to keep it up in the long term. Now, of course, automated enforcement, speed cameras and things like that, you can keep that up in the long term. But traditional police enforcement has a tendency to fluctuate over time in the way I just mentioned. Yeah, the next one. Yes, one source of uncertainty that I would like to mention here, because it is very rarely mentioned in evaluation studies that you find in the literature, is incomplete reporting of injuries, incomplete accident reporting. And at least in my part of the world, that is a growing problem, because the police report less and less. And this is one estimate I made with respect to traffic calming. If you make a summary estimate of effect in meta-analysis, and you produce a confidence interval that reflects a random variation only, that confidence interval is 5.1 percentage points. Now, if you account for the fact that there is systematic variation in the effects of traffic calming from one study to the other, from one location to the other, you increase the confidence interval to 8.7 percentage points. But if in addition to that, you also add the uncertainty introduced by incomplete and variable accident reporting, you get the confidence interval of 15.7 percentage points. And in general, the confidence intervals you find in the literature most often and most closely resemble the 5.1 percentage points to the left, rather than the 15.7 percentage points to the right. So very many studies, I think, understate the uncertainty. Of course, accounting for incomplete reporting is very difficult, because to do so, you need to have studies showing the level of reporting and the variance of the level of reporting. And if you have such studies, then you can apply an estimate that accounts for it. But very often you wouldn't have that type of study, and you would simply not know what the level of reporting was. So that is one thing which we should always remember. If we take the next one, then I think that will be my last one, actually. Well, can the pitfalls we have been discussing be avoided? Well, yes, I think we can do good before and after studies that control for long-term trends and regression to the mean. There is a well-established method for it, the empirical base method, and there are several versions of that method, actually, depending on your data availability and so on. You can do several versions of that, and those are good studies. case control studies are known for being prone to confounding, but I think they should definitely be trusted if their findings are plausible. I mean, most studies evaluating seat belts, for example, are not really before and after studies. You don't compare the same people before they wore seatbelts with after they started wearing them. What you compare is the outcomes of crashes, where there was a different seatbelt wearing. Some crashes they wore seatbelts and some they didn't. And that is a case control study and not a before after study, but still, if they find that seatbelts are protective, there are good reasons in biomechanics for believing in such a finding. As I mentioned, incomplete reporting of crashes or injuries is a potentially important source of bias and imprecision, which it is difficult to control for. But I am involved in an EU project called Levitate, which deals with connected and automated vehicles. And of course, they would have systems for recording crashes. And once vehicles in general have technology for recording crashes and transmitting those data to some central that stores them, the problem of incomplete reporting should go away once and for all, because then technology will see to it that everything is recorded. Okay.
Thanks very much.
So now I think we can have a discussion with the other participants as well.
That's right. Should I switch off the sharing of your slides?
Okay. Yeah, well, maybe some of the others will have questions, but okay.
We'll bring it back then. So we have, Rune, because we started a bit late and we have some questions, but we have a second session in 15 minutes, actually. So I'm not sure whether we'll be able to go through all the questions, but I'll try my best. We have a question from Blair Turner. He says that in many relevant studies are published by road agencies and not in journals. They are variable quality, but often subject to extensive peer review of high quality. Literature searches could be included assessment through TRD database to capture this research. How do we provide advice on assessing the quality of these studies?
Well, I think the assessment might be based on that validity framework that I mentioned, which I said could serve as a checklist, and I can use that when you are dealing both with peer-reviewed studies and with those that are not peer-reviewed. And by the way, I agree that some of these agency studies are good and they are often quite easy to obtain. I mean, Federal Highway Administration and Oslo and various agencies around publish studies and put them on their websites. So, well, one should be able to obtain them.
Okay, now we have a question from Mr. Ahmed from Bangladesh, that many drivers in Bangladesh do not have institutional training. They have been learning to drive a car from a senior driver. So if we do not arrange training, what will happen to the roads if they start driving?
Yeah, well, here again, we have the problem we touched upon earlier, that the studies of driver training have all of them been made in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, or the United States. That's where the evidence comes from. And I can imagine that traffic in Bangladesh is certainly different from what it is in the United States or in Australia, and that the educational needs for new drivers are therefore different. You need to learn different things in Bangladesh than what you need to learn in the United States. However, I can't see that it is necessarily wrong or ineffective to learn from an experienced driver. I mean, what we have found in the evaluation studies is that that is just as effective as it is to learn driving from a professional driving instructor. Both of them, both the professional driver instructor and the informal teacher should be able to tell the novice drivers about the experiences that they have made and how they have themselves learned to become a safe driver. So I'm not sure if formalizing it will necessarily make it more effective, but yeah.
What about Rune? If I remember, some of your work showed that it takes about 2 years for crash rates of new drivers to go down. Would that mean that it takes a long time to actually understand what happens on the road? And so the formal training of a couple of weeks or 3 weeks has little part in it.
Yes, I would agree on that. It takes about a couple of years, and then it goes down really much during those years and stays low for quite some time, and increases a bit in old age again, but that is for different reasons.
I would understand from your presentation that if there's a theoretical basis in the empirical findings, then it should be more widely applicable around the world. But if the theoretical basis has some gaps, then it's a problem. We have
yes. The theoretical basis I have posted now suggests that the formal training will be ineffective, and that the challenge, as I said, is carry out the training in such a way that the novice driver will correctly understand how limited his or her knowledge actually is. That's the challenge.
We have a question. I don't think you raised this issue, but there's a question on what is from Furzan. What is your idea about studies on child seat use?
Well, there are, again, a number of studies that have evaluated that, and the findings of those studies make sense as I see them. They show that child restraints, child seats, when properly used, are very protective. However, a problem is that child restraints or seats are not always properly used, and that in this case there might be a need for education, and certainly in this case also education would be effective, because most parents would like to give their children the best possible protection, so they will be highly motivated for using the restraints properly and correctly, and so for that reason they would also be willing to be guided and instructed by people about how to properly use the restraints. So I think that this is a very effective measure if properly used, yes.
There's a question that because there's high accident rates and deaths in Latin America, is that because of poor driving, lack of education, or lack of safety elements?
Well, safety is of course always influenced by very many factors. The trouble you very quickly get into in international comparisons is that you would like to compare a few countries, but the number of factors that could explain the difference between those countries is much larger than the number of countries itself. So you have, so to speak, more variables than your number of observations, and then, at least statistically speaking, you get into a problem. I know too little about the safety situation in Latin America to be able to propose any specific explanations as to why it is the way it is, or to explain why it differs between countries and things like that.
There's a question from Mr. Navid. Do you recommend to apply the EB method in less developing or developed countries where the proper and good quality of data is not available? If yes, how?
Yes, I recognize that. I did a study some years ago where I compared some simpler approaches to the empirical base method to check if the results were the same. And actually I was hoping so. Because although I strongly recommend using the best methods, I fully understand the difficulties of doing so, and that you may not be able to do so because of lack of data or poor quality of data, or the study may cost too much. It generally requires the development of an accident prediction model, and that can be quite a large task. Unfortunately, I found that the simpler methods didn't produce the same findings as the more advanced ones, but the empirical base method has developed over a long period, and initially the first versions of it were a lot simpler than those that are most commonly used today. So I would think that even a quite simple EB study would often be possible. But and if that is possible, it should certainly be applied, I think. But otherwise I don't know.
There's a very important question on how do people get your handbook?
Well, the last edition of that was published in English in 2009. And that's 11 years ago, and we have still, during those 11 years, continued to update the book in Norwegian, and unsuccessfully have tried to get funding for an updated English version of it. At one point, we even proposed to our Norwegian sponsors that we should stop updating it in Norwegian and simply start updating it in English. But our sponsors did not agree with us, so we still do the work in Norwegian. The book was published by Emerald Publishing, and I suppose it might still be available from them. Yes, there is. I see it from this. Yes, there is a Spanish and Portuguese version. The Spanish version is from 2014, so it is also a bit old. And the Portuguese one is from 2015, yes. But both the Spanish and the Portuguese version are I think, not sold commercially. They were distributed by a Spanish insurance company as a charity. So that is the Spanish insurance company. Yes, exactly. They decided who should get the book and who should not get it. So, well, they might still have some, but and be willing to give it away as a charity. But
would it be possible, Rune, that you make available the book by chapter and not the whole book, so that people who are interested in specific topics can download it?
Yeah, well, it is on our website in Norwegian, on the website of the Institute of Transparency, in precisely the form you suggest. If people go to that website, they can look up a chapter and they can download that chapter, and if they are interested in that particular chapter. It already exists in that form, but only in Norwegian, unfortunately.
So I guess through the webinar, we can appeal to all the people listening to make funds, to pressurize people who have money to make funds available to you to have those translated to English.
I would be more than happy to translate it if we got some funds for it, yes.
I guess we'll have to stop very quickly, Rune, because we have 2 minutes left because we have another session coming on. So I really want to thank you for what, there are a few questions left, but we just don't have the time.
No.
It's been fantastic.
People can email me as well, of course. If they send me a mail, I can try to answer.
That'll be great. So I'd like to thank you again. And I think one important message you've got for all of us is to be, especially our PhD students who are listening to us, that when they do their literature surveys, they be very careful in understanding what each paper says and which one is good and which one is not so good. And when they make their literature surveys and understand what to do. And so we can end with that. And I hope the things become better so all of us can meet in person very soon. And thank you very much.
I hope so too. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. So now we are going on to our second session of today in 5 minutes.